So I was just introducing Ali, and now I will hand over to you.
Thanks, Chris. So good morning, everyone, and hearty welcome to the first session of the day. As Chris said, I'm Alison Atherton. I'm going to be moderating this panel session. So I'd like to start by acknowledging the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, upon whose ancestral lands UTS stands, and pay respects to elders past, present, and emerging, acknowledging them as the traditional custodians of knowledge for this land. So I'm going to kick off by briefly introducing the topic for this morning's session, but we want to allow as much time as possible to hear from our panelists. So I'll shortly hand over to them to introduce themselves. We'll then have a panel discussion, and we'll have some time at the end, hopefully, for questions from you in the audience. The topic for this morning's session is government-led transformations towards a wellbeing economy. Making the transformation to wellbeing economy has emerged as a priority for several governments around the world in recent years. The Wellbeing Economy Governance Group was established in 2018 to support cross-government engagement, learning, and collaboration on delivering a wellbeing economy. Members include the governments of Scotland, Iceland, New Zealand, Wales, Finland, and Canada. Here in Australia, the ACT government introduced its wellbeing framework in 2020, and the Australian government has signalled its interest in this agenda, with the Treasurer Jim Chalmers including a budget paper on measuring what matters in his first budget, and committing to release a measuring what matters statement later this year, hopefully in the next few weeks. So in this session, we're going to explore what is a wellbeing economy and how can it contribute to the transformation to sustainability, and what we can learn in Australia from the experiences elsewhere with guiding a transformation towards a wellbeing economy. So we're extremely privileged this morning to be joined by three leaders in this field. We have Sophie Howe, who is the outgoing Future Generations Commissioner for Wales, and Sophie has very kindly stopped off to join us on her way to New Zealand. On the screen behind me, we have Gary Gillespie. Gary is the Chief Economist for the Scottish Government, and he's very kindly also joining us late from the UK. And we have Catherine Trebek, who is the co-founder of the Wellbeing Economy Alliance and instigator of the Wellbeing Economy Governance Group. So it's a huge privilege to have these three leaders in the field joining us today. So we're going to start with each of the panelists introducing themselves. So Catherine, to you first, perhaps you could just say a little bit about yourself, what got you into wellbeing economy ideas, what you're doing now, and also just for the benefit perhaps of some of the audience who aren't familiar with the concept, just a little overview of what the term actually means.
Thanks, Alison. Hi, everyone. I'm really glad to see you, and also add my acknowledgement to the traditional owners of the land, any First Nations folk who are here today. Really excited to be joining Sophie and Gary, people who I hugely respect and admire, who are doing an incredible job really pushing the agenda of getting some of the changes into the corridors of power that we really need to transform our economic systems the way they need to be transformed. So I describe myself as an advocate for economic system change, and that takes all sorts of different forms, writing ranty blogs, communicating about the questions we need to be asking about the economy, as you mentioned, Alison, as a co-founder for Alliance, and I'm here today with Oliver Hatson, talking about the next economy. We heard from yesterday, and also working with Central Policy Development in their wellbeing government work. And your question on how I got into this space, there's a long backstory, but one of the key moments for me was when I moved to Glasgow, actually just up the road from where Gary is now, in 2005. And what was incredibly stark to me was that there were problems in Glasgow, and I was living right near the university in Botanic Gardens, quite a nice sweet area of Glasgow, but just up the road. And you can actually track this by every train station you travel from the west of Glasgow to the east. Life expectancy for men by each station falls by about 2 years. And to just the other side of Glasgow City, life expectancy was that gap compared to where I lived was a gap of 14 years and it continued to fall even further east you went. And those gaps in life expectancy in one of the 6th richest country in GDP terms, to me, are one of the most dire indictments of the failure of the economic system that the UK and other similar countries had created. Wealth was not trickling down and people were living very, very different lives. And so then I did about 10 years of work for Oxfam, so an organisation that's known for its campaigning and efforts on global justice. And the more I got into that work, the more it became apparent to me that if we cared about global justice, we needed to look at the economic models of the global north, countries like the UK, Australia, Canada, New Zealand, the US, because they are very literally eating up more of their ecological fair share, and they're not leaving ecological room for our cousins and friends and communities around the world to increase their basic material needs. And until we address that, we're basically saying we're happy for inequality to stay the way it is. And so I started getting very anxious in Oxfam, saying we need to look and challenge the way countries like the UK, where I was living, design their production and consumption systems, what the purpose of their economy was, how much ecological room they were taking. And so then when Stuart Wallace, who had come out of retirement, he was head of the New Economics Foundation, to start the Wellbeing Economy Alliance, and he asked me to join him, I thought, yeah, this is what I need to do. And so to give you a very brief picture of what a wellbeing economy is, I actually think of it as a bit like a picnic blanket. So there are lots of different schools of thought around the world around how to change the economy, from donut economics and regenerative economics and buen vivir and feminist economics and First Nations economics and so on and so on. The wellbeing economy is not an alternative or a synonym or a competitor to that. Think of it like a picnic blanket underneath that's really welcoming all of that and showing at the deep core the connection that those different schools of thought have. They're different emphasis, yes, and different terminology that will resonate in different parts of the world. But at their core, they really share a sense that the economy needs to be designed to serve people and planet, not the other way around. And that we also need to take heed of what ecological economists have been telling us for decades, what feminist economists have been telling us for decades, and what First Nations communities have been living for millennia, that the economy is not on top of or even alongside, as you see in that sort of 1990s image of sustainable development, where you have economy and society and the environment. What we need to do is recognize that the economy is sitting within societies and the two are sitting within our planetary home. And to say that, that's quite easy to say that in a forum like this, but to deliver it and to take it seriously in the corridors of power brings about a really fundamental change of how we think about and design the rules of the game to change the economy. I'm going to give you a very, very brief sense of what it looks like in practice. You'll all be already thinking, gosh, there's a lot of changes, from how we design public transport to how we do buildings, to business models, to taxes, to all sorts of incentive systems, to the very purpose of the economy. So I think of it like a jigsaw puzzle, like a 1,000-piece jigsaw puzzle. Lots of different pieces need to be put into place. But how I wrap my head around that plethora of changes is, as with any jigsaw puzzle, when you're doing it, you start with the corners. So I think of this as the 4 Ps of the wellbeing economy jigsaw puzzle, and they are purpose. So what's the very purpose of our economy? Is it faster GDP growth, or are we going to be more nuanced about what we need more of and what we need to power down? And that also has a micro version of what sort of businesses do we need? What's the goal of businesses? The next one's prevention. Are we going to be content to spend a ton of money and resources on band-aids and healing and patching and repairing the collateral damage of the current economic system on people and planet, all that downstream response? Or are we going to raise our gaze upstream and take action there at the root causes? The next corner is pre-distribution. And this is saying redistribution after the fact is, yes, important, but it's a very, very heavy lift for government. And with the extent of tax evasion and avoidance and all the stigma that goes around that, we need to do better. And so we need to ask the economy to do more of the heavy lifting through pre-distributing the balance between rich and poor. So things like worker cooperatives, community wealth building, true cost accounting will come into play there. And then the final P is people powered.
really making sure that communities, especially those who are so often shafted by the current economic system, are at the fore of designing what sort of economic processes matter to them. So whether that's participatory budgeting or citizens' assemblies or economic democracy, so workplace democracy or stakeholders and unions and communities on boards, all of that has a role to play.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Catherine. That's a really clear picture, I think, of what we mean by wellbeing economy. So Sophie and Gary, perhaps starting with you, Sophie, maybe you can just tell us a little bit about yourself and your role in government and how the Welsh Government has been implementing these ideas around wellbeing economy.
Thank you. For me, I just arrived at 5:30 a.m. So it's not what it's a good evening. The reason why I'm here is, as you heard, I was the first generation commissioner for Wales. First Future Generations Commissioner for Wales, a post which I held for 7 years up until January of this year. What is a Future Generations Commissioner, you're probably wondering, and it's no wonder that you're wondering, because at the time I was the only Future Generations Commissioner in the world. I was described by The Guardian as the world's first minister for the unborn, which is quite a cool title. Not entirely accurate, because I wasn't a minister of the government. My job as an independently appointed commissioner was to hold the Welsh Government and all of our other public institutions, so our local authorities, our health boards, our national organisations like our Public Health Agency, Environment Agency and so on, to account on how they sought to meet today's needs without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. And I'll say a little bit more about the detail of that legislation perhaps in a moment. I suppose a little bit about my background. I was a kid who grew up in Cardiff, not quite the same track in terms of the train stations, because actually public transport in Cardiff is pretty rubbish, so we don't have that many train stations. It's improving, and that's one of the things that has come from the Future Generations Act. But I was a kid that grew up in a tough part of Cardiff, the sort of part of Cardiff that is always in the headlines for the wrong reasons: high levels of poverty, high levels of worklessness, high levels of teenage pregnancy, high levels of criminality, and so on and so on. But I happened, by virtue of the fact that both my parents worked, which was quite unusual for the area that I grew up, I happened to go to a school in the leafy suburbs, more affluent part of Cardiff, because my grandparents lived there. And the thing that's sort of always driven me in terms of my career and my journey to become the first Future Generations Commissioner is that childhood experience of seeing the difference in the expectations, the aspirations, and the life chances of the kids that I played with on the street at home versus the kids that I went to school with. So again, all of those things, lower levels of life expectancy, and so on. So I started my career in politics because of that. How could I make sure that kids from Ely, that's where I came from, had the same life chances as kids from Rubina, where I went to school? And that's really what's driven me. And when I got into politics, I was elected as a councillor at the age of 21. I was also 6 months pregnant, and I've now got 5 children. So that's kind of, shaped my view of the world as well as these things do. But what I saw is that public policy and our systems of governance are fundamentally broken. All of the things that Catherine describes there in terms of her 4 Ps are absolutely not what generally happens in public policy and governance. And in fact, the reverse, even if you want to try and make them happen, the system pulls you away from them. So what I could see is that actually in terms of prevention, pretty much all public policy is picking up the pieces of things that have gone wrong elsewhere in the system. There's also a challenge in terms of the system not being joined up at all. And that was to my utter frustration, both as a local councillor, then as an advisor to 2 of our first ministers in government.
the system is fragmented and doesn't join up and doesn't get to the root causes of things. So when in 2015, Wales passed or became the first country in the world to pass legislation to protect the interests of future generations, this was something which I saw as an opportunity to perhaps get to some of those root causes. So our legislation does a number of things. First of all, it has that overarching requirement. Our public institutions must demonstrate how they're meeting today's needs without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. It then sets out 7 long-term wellbeing goals, and one of Catherine's P's, people-powered. So our 7 long-term goals were devised in conversation with the citizens of Wales, a national dialogue called the Wales that we want. And there's a bit of a movement growing here in Australia for a similar national dialogue, perhaps to inform the Treasurer's wellbeing approach and so on. But the people of Wales were asked, what is the Wales you want to leave behind to your children, your grandchildren and future generations to come? And at the same time, the UN Sustainable Development Goals were in development. So we looked at what was happening internationally. We looked at what the people of Wales said. And when you give people an opportunity, not just to perhaps think about their own lives right in front of them, the fact that they, might not be able to get a doctor's appointment, or, their rubbish hasn't been collected by the council, or whatever it might be, when you give them that opportunity to think, well, what sort of ancestor do I want to be? What do I want to leave behind? What the people of Wales told us is that protecting our natural assets were really important to them. Wales, if any of you have ever been, and you should visit, it's rich in natural assets, beautiful countryside. Also, our heritage in terms of a long association with coal, and the people of Wales recognise that actually some of the damage that we'd done in Wales, and that damage had contributed in other parts of the world, that we had a responsibility to put that right. They felt that their language, heritage and culture was really important, something which doesn't often get talked about in, as a kind of key metrics in government policy terms. The fact that we wanted to keep people well, we wanted not just to treat them when they're ill. Yes, our National Health Service in Wales and in the UK is much loved, but it's actually recognised as really being a national illness service as well. It only intervenes when something or someone is broken. So these 7 long-term wellbeing goals, and again, to one of Catherine's first P's, that is our purpose. Now, I always say you wouldn't think it was revolutionary for a country to have a set of long-term goals. It sounds quite, commonsensical, really, doesn't it? In fact, the minister who eventually took this legislation through the Senate, the Welsh Parliament, described it as the Common Sense Act. Sadly, we need to legislate for common sense, because in public policy terms, and I worked at all different levels of government, I can assure you common sense is not at all common. So hence why we are the first country in the world to put a set of long-term goals, not just in a kind of some high-level aspirational policy document, which can change from one government to the next, but actually set out in law. And that is the first most important thing about our approach. It's not going to change from one election to the next, and it gives the people of Wales and our government and all of our public institutions clarity on where it is that we're going. The next thing that the legislation does is set out 5 ways of working. And again, this was the reason really why the minister described it as the Common Sense Act, speaks to a number of Catherine's P's as well. So first of all, planning for the long term. So recognising the long-term consequences of the things that we do. Absolutely absent in most government policy making. In fact, there's a guy who's a professor of existential threat at Oxford University, a guy called Professor Toby Ord. And again, I often say, don't ever hang out with the existential threat people if you're having a bit of a down day. It'll make your day worse. But he says actually globally, we spend more on the purchase of ice cream than governments spend on foresighting, looking at future trends and scenarios, and looking at existential threats. So that tells you the scale of the challenge. We just don't, pick anything, pick COVID, pick the climate crisis, pick the fact that we're not doing what we need to do to kind of regulate and deal with AI and so on. We're just not looking for the long term. We're constantly just managing a crisis. So a legal duty on our institutions to think and act for the long term. one of Catherine's P's, prevention. So we should seek to prevent problems from occurring or getting worse. Integration, so this is recognising the links between each of the wellbeing goals, and a duty on our public institutions to set objectives which maximise their contribution to all 7 of those wellbeing goals. And I would say that's another game changer, because what that requires all of our institutions to do is to look to long-term prevention, but also to work out where the connections are between things and to work and act beyond their boundaries. So again, to Catherine's point on kind of life expectancy and health, actually, public transport interventions are public health interventions. Actually, if we're looking at how we address the disparities in life expectancy for different racial groups, what you will find is that people who are predominantly in Black, Asian, minority ethnic communities in the UK are also the people who live in the highest areas of air pollution and have the least access to public open space and nature and so on. So all of these things are interconnected. So we must recognise that, I suppose the flip side of that, thinking about our National Health Service, if the healthcare system across the world was a country, it would be the 5th biggest emitter of carbon in the world. All of the experts tell us that actually carbon and climate change and so on is one of the biggest threats to human health. Planetary health, the biggest threats to human health. So on the one hand, we've got a healthcare system trying to keep people, well, trying to treat people when they're ill. On the other hand, we've got a healthcare system which is a major cause of the things that is going to make people ill. So the system is kind of crazy there and needs to join up. The 4th area is collaboration. And the 5th area, again, to one of Catherine's P's, involvement. So involving citizens in decision making. And then the establishment of a Future Generations Commissioner. So my job was to hold these organisations to account on how they met those long-term goals, monitor and assess the progress that they were making. In reality, that meant being an advocate for future generations. I often call it calling out the madness of policy decisions. Banging heads together with different organisations when they weren't working together, putting forward new and progressive ideas, like Wales having a universal basic income, like the fact that we've stopped building roads, like the fact that we've transformed our school curriculum so that it should be fit for the future and aligned around our 7 wellbeing goals. So challenging, supporting, and perhaps if we get into the discussion, I can give you some more examples of the transformations that we've seen in Wales. But I think, pointing over here, if you haven't seen, this is from the Museum of the Future, and Mel here is responsible with others for developing this. You'll see there that 2027 is an aspiration for Australia to have the first Minister of the Unborn. So I guess that's the main call today from me.
Fantastic. Thank you, Sophie. Yeah, I mean, I just think it's so inspiring what's happened in Wales and this the goal on the wall. I really hope that comes to pass because I think it would be amazing. So Gary, just to pass to you now, we'd also love to hear from you about your role in the Scottish Government and how the Scottish Government has been implementing wellbeing frameworks.
Yeah, no bother. It's a pleasure to join you from Glasgow, late in the evening here, but obviously great to be here. Great to see Sophie and Catherine and on the screen as well. So look forward to seeing you again in person soon. So for me, name's Gary Gillespie. My day job is the Chief Economic Advisor within the Scottish Government. I've been a civil servant for about 20 years. Before that, I was an academic economist, if you like, if that's such a term. And my role within government obviously encompasses quite a traditional chief economic advisor role, but my particular interest over the last probably 10 years has been around economic strategy and how the economy delivers for people, really. And within the Scottish Government, we've had the one government now in different forms since 2007, and the economic strategy has moved from really a growth-based strategy to a kind of socio-economic to now a socio-economic environment, which I would describe as a kind of wellbeing economy approach, recognising the need to take a system approach to address the challenges that we face. And as Catherine described, the kind of picnic blanket or whatever. So sometimes this can be really, everything can contribute to this. So the way I kind of look at it is, I look at it through the lens of the economy. How does the economy impact on well-being, both for people and planet? And what's the role of the economy within a well-being economy? Because obviously across other areas of government, we've got health, transport, social policy, there's loads of different policies going on. In Scotland, a bit like Wales, we've again gone back fully to 2007 with the introduction of a national performance framework, looking at how you measure, what you measure matters, looking at an outcomes-based approach for Scotland. Started to get into that type of conversation, and that was really all about joining up government. We have a former Deputy First Minister that used to say, no one area of government can deal with the challenges we face in isolation. So very much always about the join up. As Sophie was describing her role, it's really the same. It's about the join up across areas. It's absolutely key. So that's the kind of backdrop. I think where wellbeing economy really came to fruition was, as you described in the introduction, around 2018. And prior to that, with Catherine, we're having conversations with different countries around a different approach to how you could look at your kind of economic system. And we introduced, we were part of the group, it's now known as the Wellbeing Economy Governments. It was launched in 2018 with Iceland, New Zealand, and then Finland and Wales join, and we have Canada participating as well. Now, you might say, well, what every country's doing stuff slightly different. Again, Catherine's picnic blanket analogy is really good, but we're all kind of going in the same direction, and there's slightly different emphases within countries from where actually the policy area sits. So it can be health, it can be treasury, it can be economy, it can be future generations, it can be about gender, it can be different, but the main thing is what you're trying to do with that. The group has been running just over around 5 years. We do something similar to this, where we come together virtually, given the different time zones. It's usually a wee bit earlier in the evening for me, but it's late in the evening for our colleagues in Finland, Iceland, and it's early morning for our colleagues in New Zealand. And Canada have the best spot in the middle of the day. But really what we are doing, as Alison described, is really we're collaborating on policy innovations. We're sharing the experience, the practical experience that Sophie touched on, about how you try and bring implementation within government across policy areas. And I suppose we're joining up to support each other, create political kind of unions, and be more cohesive in terms of our policies. I mean, just to give you a flavour of some of the areas we've covered, we tend to have sessions where two countries will present on one topic, and then we have a discussion. We'll record the outputs, we'll share that. We also have key speakers that come onto the group. Catherine was one of those, talking about her own work, other experts to share. But we've covered performance frameworks. All of the countries have performance frameworks, so they're kind of beyond GDP stuff. We've talked about wellbeing budgeting, something of real interest. New Zealand lead, other countries are doing that as well. In Scotland, just transition, how we move to our net zero targets. Indigenous populations, both New Zealand and Canada did a session around those. Gender inequality, Iceland led discussions on that. We've done child poverty, sustainable tourism, health and wellbeing. So you get a sense of that kind of picnic blanket. And actually how you bring it all together is really, I think, what this session's about how governments actually change the system and how you do that. But that's really just to give you a sense of that. My team within the Scottish Government, we do the Secretariat for the Wellbeing Economy Governments. Actually, we had a meeting just 2 weeks ago in Iceland. There was a Wellbeing Economy forum organised by the Icelandic government. Really interesting discussions with participants, including the World Health Organization and other countries. But you get a sense of a collaboration for change coming together really. And I think the debate's moving now really to the kind of policy and implementation rather than the what do you mean? Though having said that, there is quite a lot of discussions. What exactly do you mean? And as Catherine said, there's a number of different definitions for this, but not to get hung up on definitions. The main thing is recognising that something about changing the system, something about joining up, there's something about we've all got nature, net zero targets, we've all got issues, particularly in Scotland, around wellbeing. Catherine touched on about life expectancy, but there's also issues around health, healthy life expectancy, drugs deaths, and there's a real opportunity to kind of share that and drive. Our big focus in Scotland at the minute is really, we have a cabinet secretary now for wellbeing economy, fair work and energy, and we're trying, mainstreaming it's maybe the wrong word, but we're trying to bring more stakeholders into understanding what we mean by this, and in particular the business community. So we're talking to the business community about how they contribute to a wellbeing economy, what it means to them. Do they recognise in terms of how they act in the economy, how that actually impacts on both people's well-being through fair work, how they treat people, how they purchase goods, how they use energy, all of those types of conversations. So to us, that's really important, and mainstreaming it. I've mentioned just transition. We're also doing community wealth building. There's community ownership. We've produced and published a wellbeing economy monitor. We've developed policy frameworks and tools, but really we're still at the stage of really trying to get that implementation and system change, which is really key. But it's part of a journey, and the journey continues, and it's like a snowball rolling down a hill. It gets bigger as it keeps going. So hopefully this will add another turn. But I'll pause there, Alison, because I know you'll want to kind of come back to questions and other comments.
Thanks, Gary. That's great. And really fantastic to hear about the really significant progress that is happening in Scotland as well as Wales. I'd say in Australia, we're not quite as progressed yet. I don't think that's controversial. We're really in the early stages of having these conversations about wellbeing economy. What do you think that Australia can learn from the experiences that you have had, particularly Gary and Sophie, in actually trying to implement wellbeing frameworks?
Shall I pick up? So I think it's really positive that the Treasurer has given this commitment to a wellbeing budget. I don't think it's dissimilar to what we're seeing in perhaps some of the other countries that we've talked about who are joining this wellbeing economy movement. However, what I see in different parts of the world is that the easy bit of all of this is get in place a load of metrics, call it a wellbeing budget, and our work here is done. But it's not, is it? The big sort of transformation is about how do you embed that throughout the system? How is the wellbeing metrics that you've got actually informing decision making? Who's checking within that system whether those wellbeing metrics have been applied? Actually, I think wellbeing, perhaps I would say this because this is the way that we do it, but I think wellbeing goals are better than metrics. If you blindly follow kind of metrics, they can often have kind of perverse consequences. I think that the other thing is that what are the rules of engagement, or what are the rules within the system? That's where these 5 ways of working, which I think if we swept away, and I'm sure in this audience here we've got people who are experts in purpose-driven organizations and governance and all of these different things, but if we swept all of that away and just said start from scratch, and those 5 principles: long-term prevention, integration, collaboration, involvement, they're pretty good, I would say, as kind of principles for decision making. So there's something there which almost, if you applied those 5 principles of decision making, you would almost like reach a wellbeing economy in your set of wellbeing goals in any case. So there's something for me about great that we're starting there, but it cannot end there. And I think we've got to go further to sort of question and challenge, okay, so what? So what's changing? How are your spending decisions and priorities changing? How is this embedded right through the system? One of the last things that I did in my term as commissioner was to use my powers. I couldn't force anyone to do anything or stop anyone doing anything, but the toughest end of my powers was something called Section 20 review powers, where I could go into a particular organisation or collection of organisations to review them or on a particular issue, policy, or you know, to just review the whole organisation in terms of how they were performing against the Future Generations Act. So I did that in government, looked at, with the exam question being, how well is the Welsh Government implementing the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act? Of course, I knew the answer to that question, because you never go in and do those things unless you know the answer, do you? And, you know, we have a you know, improvement framework around that. But the, you know, if I could leave you with one finding there, is none of this is easy. And what we're trying to change here is the habits of very many lifetimes, how our civil servants have been, you know, have been taught, how they've been performance managed and measured throughout their careers, how the system actually works, all the blockages in the system. And that's before you get to the interactions between each of the different public bodies. So it's not enough just to say, hey, there's a new show in town and it's a wellbeing budget. That's just the starting point. You have to go right throughout the system, and you have to be kind of quite patient that even when you have legislation like we did, or like we have in Wales, that's not going to transform the system overnight. So
Great. And just a quick follow up on that. How important do you think the legislation is in driving the change?
So I think the critical part about the legislation is that, you know, it has staying power, doesn't it? Of course, you know, legislation could be swept away, but it's, you know, it's unlikely, particularly in the Welsh political context. So people know that that's not, you know, that those wellbeing goals are not going to change, you know, every political cycle. And that's been really important, we found, both for, you know, it took a good 3-4 years for public bodies to get their heads around this, and they would dabble in with 1 or 2 wellbeing goals, and then it was 3 or 4, and then they started thinking, well, actually there's more that we could do here. If there was a new government that came in and said, all right, you know, like I said, new show in town now and all change, you know, if you're being you know, if you're being kind, I suppose that means there's confusion out there and people are, you know, in a muddle about where they're supposed to be. If you're not being kind, those people who don't want to change, the confusion allows them to just not change. So I think that kind of longevity issue is the really critical part about that. The other critical part, I think, of the legislation is what I found as commissioner, the really important thing was finding these people in the system who I describe as frustrated champions. So these are people who, you know, maybe they're the social workers who are seeing, you know, the 3rd or 4th generation of the same family coming into state care because we've never got to the root cause. Maybe they're the highways engineer who built a road 15 years ago and have now, because of congestion, have now found that that road is full of traffic, and we're going to build another road because it's full of, you know, because we've got congestion, so on, nothing ever changes. So those people, they are your champions in the system for change. Now, for them to be able to take a piece of legislation and waive this piece of legislation at the, and I'm sorry if there's any of you here, but finance directors, lawyers, all of those people that I describe as the abominable no men in systems, the people who say, no, you can't change, to waive a piece of law at them, that is a powerful thing for these frustrated champions to help them to drive change in their organisations. And then, of course, I suppose the law having a commissioner, someone who's going to police that law and intervene if things are going wrong.
Fantastic. Thanks, Sophie. Gary, pass to you on this one. What can we learn here from your experience in Scotland?
Yeah, no bother. I agree with loads of what Sophie said there. I think for me, so the step one is measurement's important, but that's just the first step. And I think all countries measure what's important to you, measure what matters. I think as Sophie's saying, it really gets into implementation and how you drive the change across the system and within government, but across all areas of government, and also with the kind of stakeholders that are out there day in, day out. So that seems like a lot. But if you think about, you can do it legislative. I think I'm kind of mixed about the legislative approach. So you kind of waive public duties. We've got public duties for everything now, but the legislative approach is one way. You can do it through budgets, which the public sector respond to at least. Maybe it's not the right way, but budgets and trying to create incentives for people to collaborate. I think there's something about maybe picking a number of areas. So when you look at the wellbeing budgets, they tend to kind of reflect the priorities, even the priorities of the country at that time. So it can be child poverty, it can be climate change, net zero, nature, children's wellbeing, perhaps. It can be health and wellbeing, COVID recovery or whatever. But if you take 4 or 5 kind of big themes and actually do the join up on them, you're starting to build a kind of coalition, because you won't, the way government's set up, justice system has its particular objectives, transport has that, health, education, and it's trying to find that kind of cross-cutting part. The other bit is, if you can depoliticize this, if you can really talk about outcomes that people want, then it survives government change. And I think that's quite important. So that means it's got to be open, it's got to be transparent, and people have got to see you have a new government, they can determine their priorities within the framework, but you're still doing a system approach. You're still looking at a broader dashboard, you're still looking at policies, and you're forcing that join up. The join up's really hard. You'd think, oh, it's obvious everybody wants to achieve outcomes, but the systems revert to the mean, reverts all the time. People change, people come, and it's trying to keep that constant kind of change. And ultimately, once you get that cultural change, that norm change, then it becomes the new norm, and then it's much more embedded. So I know we're talking to an audience that specialises in transformation and stuff, but there is something about getting to that point where it becomes normalised, and everybody recognises that as part of their role, transport's not separate from health, education, well-being, it's all part, and that's the bit. So there's something really about, so getting back to kind of mainstream is maybe not the right term, but there's something about just trying to get that clarity. But let me pause there again.
Thank you, Gary. And Catherine, I think you'd like to
Yeah.
comment on this one as well.
I just want to build on what Gary was saying there around depoliticizing this and making this about people, because I think there's a risk in Australia that there's a fundamental first step miss. So the sequence here really matters. So at the moment, federal government is talking about measuring what matters. But in terms of finding out what matters to everyday people, they've done a really lame job. They've put a couple of consultations on their website. Who responds to consultations on government websites? Well, people like me, not people driving Ubers, washing dishes, cleaning hospital wards. So what the government needs to, and this is where Wales, best than any other country that I've seen, has really done this, is they took the time to have a national conversation about what sort of country they want to be. And Australia needs to do that to, one, get people engaged and build the mandate, take it beyond party political, especially with a 3-year term here. Yeah. That's absolutely crucial, because it's very hard for government to then ignore something that comes with a very rich, deep, engaged mandate from a national consultation. So first, find out what matters to people. Then the next step is measure that. And that's complicated, but that's relatively simple, because, you know, compared to the next step. Over half of the OECD countries now have multidimensional wellbeing frameworks. But does that mean over half of the OECD countries are well on their way to building wellbeing economies? No, because the next step is the harder bit. And that's where you have to make the measures matter. And that's where some of the ways of working that Sophie was outlining and Gary's outlined are really crucial. But I think we need to push the Australian government right now to stand this up on a really deep, inclusive, properly resourced, because as we were hearing yesterday, you know, when you're living on the breadline, to go to our community meeting and talk about what matters to you is an expensive thing. So it needs to be resourced so it's properly inclusive as well. And that's something we need to, all of us here, all your spheres of influence, we really need to push the Australian government on.
Thanks, Catherine. Sophie, just building on that, do you want to say a little bit about the national conversation that happened in Wales, how that happened and what that was like?
Yes, so the government sponsored the conversation but didn't run it, and I think that's quite important as well. So they commissioned an NGO called Cynnal Cymru, who were sort of working in the sustainability space to be the convener, I suppose, of the national conversation. It had a range of different ways in which people could engage with it, you know, the standard stuff, online interactions and surveys and so on, but the majority of it ran on a kind of hub and spoke model. So Cynnal Cymru worked with a range of other organisations, some of them geographical. So the community council in one of our towns, Llanelli, through the Wales We Want conversation, ran their own conversation, the Llanelli We Want, and they were able to reach out into different parts of their community. The Women's Institute held their own conversations across all their membership groups. The Young Farmers Association did similar things. Schools in Wales were engaged through a range of different means. Some of them were, you know, young people were writing postcards to their future selves. Some of them were building the communities that they wanted to use Minecraft, a range of different kind of techniques like that. And all of that data from all of this, the different entities who were running their own conversations was then gathered up into the centre and analysed. And I think there were about 13 sort of principles, if you like, or 13 key issues that were coming from that consistently. Of course, you still got your kind of, you know, the live issue here is the potential for this hospital to close, and we don't want that to happen. And you've got to find a way of, you know, listening and hearing those conversations, but drawing out really the core, what is beneath that, what is actually, you know, the vision that you want to sort of leave behind. I think if we were doing it again, and so we did this in 2014, I think if we were doing it again, we would probably build in more of an approach which enabled people to understand the potential future trends and scenarios for their areas. So that was coming out in what people were talking about. But I do think, you know, we probably do need to be talking about, okay, so what are the predictions in terms of climate for this area? What are we looking at in terms of the ageing population, and so on and so on. So there are different methodologies which, you know, which are out there now. And, you know, I'm working with a country who's looking to do something similar. And the things that I'm advising them is perhaps something along the lines of a hub and spoke model as we did in Wales, but really embedding in how do we help citizens to understand what the potential futures might be, and help them to sort of frame the conversation with that in mind.
Yeah, excellent. Now I'm conscious of the time and wanting to leave a bit of time for questions from the audience, but maybe just one more for you, if you can try to answer this one quickly. It's not a small question though. Philosophers have said that it's easier to imagine the end of the world than to imagine the end of capitalism. So when we're talking about transforming the economic system, it'd be good just to explore what your thoughts are on what that really means. Are we talking about the end of capitalism? Are we talking about the end of growth economies? What does it actually look like in the future if we've managed to implement a wellbeing economy framework?
Well, really briefly. So on the growth question, particularly, it depends. So growth is this abstract term, isn't it? You know, like move. So if Alice and I said, hey, move, you'd say, well, what, which over there, here, faster, you know, that way. And we need the same sort of questions with growth. What do we need more of? What sort of business activities do we need to encourage? And what, if we're really honest, do we need to power down because they're misaligned with collective well-being and a healthy planet? And so we need to have that more nuanced conversation. So there's lots we need to grow and nurture. And that's where government comes in, is to design the rules of the game, to encourage and cajole and incentivize that, but also to help power down in a just way the sort of activities that are not misaligned with the sort of country we need. So it's a more qualitative question around growth, rather than just this false binary between yes growth or no growth. And I hope, you know, I'd hope countries in this day and age are up to that. In terms of capitalism, again, it depends. I think there are a lot of different definitions of capitalism. Colleagues in America often tend to define it as markets. There will be markets in a wellbeing economy. I'd love to see worker co-ops trading with community interest companies, you know, sharing with social enterprises and locally owned community development trusts, will there be capitalism in the form of huge inequalities of power and rent seeking and extraction? No. So again, it depends on how we're defining things. Happy to keep talking about that, though.
Thanks, Catherine. Sophie or Gary, anything to add to that?
I agree with everything that Catherine said there. I think that the challenge, however, isn't it, is, we're here at the moment, we need to go over there. And in the middle are a load of politicians and people with vested interests. So how do we shift from here to there and try to bring those people with us? Well, part of that is the, I sort of describe them as the League of Small and Awesome Nations. You'll notice that a lot of the countries that are in this Wellbeing Economy Alliance are small and awesome nations. If Australia were to join, then we might have to call them League of Just Awesome Nations. So there's something there about the sort of the front runners, isn't there, and showing the way and so on. I think that in everything that we do in terms of transformation, just having a good idea and a really, really sensible idea and so on is never enough. You need the people who are going to understand how the system works, cajole and change the system bit by bit. Catherine's analogy about the jigsaw, it's exactly that. You can't ever have that like one transformation. It's this bit, this bit, this bit, and growing it in those ways. I think that there are some challenges around the movement itself. Again, I like the analogy of the picnic blanket, but sometimes, if you're a policymaker, well, is it degrowth? Is it sustainable growth? Is it wellbeing economy? Is it sustainable development goals? Is it future generations? Is it what is it? Are all of those things the same thing? Why do we have people doing sustainable development goals over here and quality of life measures or wellbeing economics over here? There's something there around that kind of complex landscape. So I think it's a bit of a challenge also to the whole movement to kind of come together and perhaps sort of explain that a bit better. And I think some of that is starting to happen. There was a big conference on, I think it was actually called, was it called the Degrowth Conference? Beyond Growth, there we are. There's another term, beyond growth, which was held in the European Union and, had Ursula von der Leyen, who's the president of the EU Commission and so on, was speaking. So you can see how it's starting to become a more mainstream movement, but I think it needs everyone sort of pulling together in terms of understanding what it is. And perhaps understanding what presses the buttons of the people that we need to move in particular ways. But that's just the kind of former politician in me working. How do you get from there to over there with all of these difficult people in the middle?
Thanks, Sophie. Gary?
And I'll just add a brief bit because I think Catherine and Sophie covered it great. For me, I think and thinking about it in the future it's a bit like that analogy. The more things change, the more they stay the same. And actually, we're kind of think about the change as additive. So we're in a kind of situation where we've got climate, nature targets, and we're going to have to change the system that we've got at the minute to move towards those. So thinking about it in that context, the structures of society, economy will be similar. As Catherine said about growth, we'll think about it differently. It'll not be the way we think about it just now, but many aspects of the economy, innovation, technology, competition, different aspects will still be there. So try to think about it in that kind of context. I mean, everything evolves all the time. The economy's changing at the moment. Everything changes all the time. And I think COVID is a good example of, certainly in the UK, experience where our lives changed overnight, essentially how we lived and worked. So you can get in periods of kind of change or flux, that kind of whole system change can come more quickly. But I think we're changing what we have rather than rebooting everything at the one time. I think that's the challenge.
Thanks, Gary. Okay, we've probably just got about 5 minutes left. So 2 minutes left. So maybe a quick question or two from the audience, if anyone would like to ask, or online. This is monitoring online. There's a roving mic, so just put your hands up if you'd
See
like
a
to.
hand over there.
And maybe just to introduce yourself briefly, your name and where you're from.
Hi, Amanda Carl from The Next Economy. I have to ask this question. Can you give an example? I guess probably Sophie or Gary. I've been doing a lot of work with different levels of government, and it's great when you find the champions and there's people open to integrating it within the system. But there are these difficult people, and there are very strong vested interests that can derail things, even if it looks like things are being integrated. So I was just wondering if there's an example that you can give us of where you've actually been able to tackle or take on vested interests, I guess, more head on and succeeded in that. Is there an example?
Yep.
So the first big test of the Future Generations Act was the government plan to spend the entire of their borrowing capacity on building a 13-mile stretch of motorway to deal with the problem of congestion at one of our major routes, the M4, around Newport. I intervened in that issue and asked the government to explain to me how they'd applied the Future Generations Act and the 7 wellbeing goals to their proposal. So how it was in line with our goal of a prosperous Wales, which talks about productive, innovative, low carbon society, which uses resources efficiently and proportionately and acts on climate change, how it was in line with the goal of a resilient Wales, which is about ecological resilience. It was going to go through a nature reserve, how it was in line with the goal of a healthier Wales, illegal levels of air pollution, increasing rates of obesity, how it was in line with the goal of a more equal Wales. 25% of the lowest income families in that region don't own a car. So are you seriously going to spend the entire of the government's borrowing capacity on an initiative which is going to benefit the already better off? And how they'd applied long-term trends and scenarios, basically how they'd applied the whole act to that. That was considered to be a done deal because the Conservative Secretary of State for Wales described the congestion as a foot on the neck of the economy in Wales, and all of the business interests, wanted that road to be built. To cut a long story short, those interventions and the application of the Future Generations Act, or my challenge around how they apply the Future Generations Act, led to the government changing their minds. They cancelled the building of that road, and I then intervened further on their budgeting. How are you showing that your budget is applying the wellbeing goals in terms of transport? That has led to a shift. We were spending 2/3 of our infrastructure investment on building roads. That went down to 1/3. The difference went into public transport and active travel. And now we have essentially a moratorium on road building in Wales. So 55 pre-approved road building schemes, 51 of them have been cancelled permanently, and we have a completely transformed transport strategy which puts walking and cycling, because it's better for your well-being, at the top of the hierarchy. So I was public enemy number 1 for a period of time with the business community. Actually, I think people have now just, and we're also rolling out 20-mile-an-hour zones across Wales as well. There's still controversy around that. Everyone wants to declare a climate emergency until it means their road isn't being built and so on. But I think, having someone who can take some of the flack for that, and I'm okay with taking the flack, and also having a law which says you have to do that, actually that does give the government some cover to do the right thing. We have a legal duty to do this.
Happy to come in a quick addition to that as well. Most of the pushback you'll get in vested interests is probably from the business community, because they don't like maybe change, or the view change as being disruptive for them. So I think in our experience, the 2015 economic strategy gave an equal weighting to addressing inequality as it did to competitiveness. And we had businesses saying, why are you talking to us about inequality? We're wealth creators, we're employing people. And actually it started conversations about real living wage, in-work poverty, the role of business within that, fair work. And we got the businesses to agree to the formation of a business pledge that was basically about paying the real living wage, 0-hour contracts, different characteristics. And essentially it was about kind of raising awareness and changing the norms within the sectors. And once some businesses started doing it, others followed. I'll give you just 2 stats. At the start of that, there was about 84% of people in Scotland earned the real living wage. We were the same as the UK average. It's now about 92%. And we're the highest of the 4 nations within the UK. So you can make change, but it's about having those conversations, open and honest. That's why we're having the dialogue with business just now about the role of business in a wellbeing economy. You've got to you've got to kind of take it on and have open conversations.
Can I
Thank
just say one final line? I think both those examples show that you need political leadership willing to stare down the vested interests and hold the line. And they will do that if they feel the community's behind them.
Yeah,
So we need to counteract that way to the vested.
absolutely. Thank you. I think we're out of time. I'm very sorry to say that we're out of time because really I think we could carry on this conversation all day. I just want to say on behalf of everyone here, thank you so much. Your wisdom, your insight, your experience, all three of you in this issue is just outstanding. And it's been a pleasure and a privilege to hear your thoughts today. And thank you everyone for joining us. And I hope you enjoy the rest of the day. Thank you.